Hi, welcome to Phenomenology. I'm Mark Thorsby. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Edmund Husserl's text, Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Philosophy, first book. This is also known as Ideas 1. So welcome back, everyone. First off, let me begin by saying I hope you've been watching the video series and we've been looking at really tracking Edmund Husserl's argument along with him in his discussion of pure phenomenology. And it's worth remarking a couple important things. Number one is that phenomenology for Husserl here, he's doing a pure phenomenology, which means he's looking at the most basic questions and trying to understand in the most clear, and I would say basic sense possible, the underlying presuppositions and results of a universal phenomenology for all different types of phenomenology. So this is a pure phenomenology, and for phenomenological philosophy, what we're going to be looking at in our next video is we're going to be looking at how another philosopher, Martin Heidegger, is able to articulate one type of phenomenology in his text, Being and Time. And it's probably the more important text, to be honest, from what we've been reading. We're going to be looking at our next video at the introduction of Being and Time. And then in a subsequent video, we'll be taking a look at Emmanuel Levinas's text, Totality and Infinity, where he gives another phenomenology. So remember, Husserl is laying down the sort of groundwork to the very beginning of the science itself. That's how he understands his role here as a discipline maker, you might even say, right, a whole category of knowledge, an epistemological builder is what Husserl is in a very important sense. But in this video, we're not going to be watching all of the rest of Husserl's videos, or I won't be making videos for all the rest of Husserl's chapters. But we are going to conclude our discussion of Husserl with the last chapter of this section, which is called Noesis and Noema. And this is chapter 3. And you recall from the last video, we just got an early articulation of what he means by noesis. You're going to see these terms they're a little bit cumbersome in the sense they're easy to confuse because they roll off the tongue similarly. But you're going to get the idea here that he's talking about very distinct, very different things. And in the last video, he started talking about noesis, but you're probably sort of thinking after watching the video lecture, what exactly does the noesis mean here? And we're going to see he defines it in a more proper sense, and he's also able to articulate really a sister concept, the noema. So that's what we're going to take a look at in today's video. So he starts off with some basic preliminary remarks here, which is mainly, yes, of course, intentionality is what we've been talking about. Remember, intentionality is the principal theme of phenomenology. And talking about consciousness of, right? The conscious is directional, as it were. He says, on the one hand, this is totally obvious, right? We all know that my consciousness is always sort of something. I'm never conscious of nothing or everything, right? But there's always some sort of particularity in view of consciousness, and it always is like that, even when I try to make it not like that. But on the other hand, that means it's completely enigmatic, right? What exactly does that mean, right? So there's an importance here, and he sort of talks about there's this distinction, and really the goal of this chapter is really to broaden our understanding of intentionality. So I want you to think about that as we go through some of his analytic points or philosophical points, and to keep in mind here that we're talking about intentionality, right? This most basic and universal feature for consciousness. Now, the importance, I had to put this passage in here because he emphasizes to his reader in a really beautiful fashion, and I feel like as we've been reading this text, we've been able to get to know Husserl a little bit more. He emphasizes what we might call the importance of eidetic fidelity, that is, of being faithful, that the phenomenologist should remain faithful to what they're actually uncovering here and resist this urge to theorize, right? Quote, if the right attitude has been won, right, and made secure by practice, above all, however, if one has acquired the courage to obey clear eidetic data with a radical lack of prejudice, radical in the sense that we've given up all of our previous presuppositions, then firm results will be produced, right? So he's sort of be faithful to phenomenology here. It's very difficult, and it's important because I know that if you've been reading along in this text, there have been points where it's very almost impenetrable in terms of the formation of his articulation. So, but Husserl even says at one point in this chapter, he says, it's hard. This is really, really hard. So if you're finding this difficult, don't be downtrodden because so did Husserl. So did the guy who came up with this. So you're understanding it correctly, potentially. It's just hard stuff. So be faithful as a phenomenologist. Let's give up our radical prejudice. Let's have a radical lack of prejudice and give up all of our theorization and our previous beliefs philosophically about all these arguments, and let's just think about consciousness. And we have to be forgiving of Husserl's language, I think, because terminologically, he's using the language of, he's using a previous language because all languages are given to us before us. And so he's trying to do some language building in this text, and it makes it really hard. So bear with him, and he's encouraging you here to be faithful. Now, section 88, so he jumps right into it. And here he talks about, let's talk about the really inherent and intentive components of mental processes. So here the question is, okay, we have these mental processes in consciousness. And we have intentionality here, but what are the basic components of intentionality? How can we understand this? And here he introduces the Noema. We're finally going to get introduced to the Noema, and we'll have our twin sisters together, right? So there's a key distinction here, which is basically that on the one hand, when we talk about intentionality, we can talk about the components of intentionality proper, right? So what are the proper components? We also have to recognize that we can also talk about the intentional correlates that we have. Now, keep in mind here that, for instance, that there's a way in which I have, for instance, in intentionality, I have an experience of the water bottle. I used this in the last video, right? I have an experience of the water bottle, and there's intentionality. So there's components that are just proper part and parcel of the intentional mental state itself. But I'm also comporting myself towards this object, right? I'm recognizing it in consciousness, and I'm directing myself towards it. And that means that there's correlations going on. And that means there's also components of those correlations. So he says, for instance, on the one hand, we can talk about things that are really inherent in the mental process, that which is intrinsic to the mental process itself. But we can also talk about the characteristics of something here, right? Because we're conscious of this, so there's components that relate to the of, if you will. So there's a sort of separation here, and this is the formal separation between the noesis on the one hand, which is what we talked about last time, and the noema, right? So the noema represent the characteristics of something, right? Perception has its noema, and here we can think of is that perception itself has its own noema, but the other things can too, right? But there, to talk about the noema of perception is to talk about the perception as it's perceived, right? Or the willing as it's willed, right? In that sort of sense. And so here's sort of an example. I pulled this picture off the internet. It doesn't look very good. It's supposed to be a red apple tree, because he gives this example of when we see the red apple tree in so imagine you were seeing, sorry. Imagine, for instance, that we're seeing the red apple tree, right? The noema here refers ultimately to the way in which I'm related to the tree in consciousness, I guess you might say. Whereas the noesis refers to the really inherent part of consciousness in the experience of seeing the red tree. So section 89, jumping forward here. And by the way, take a look at that passage, because he does a really nice job with it. In section 89, it says, noematic statements and statements about actuality. So here he sort of begins a sort of step back and says, okay, let's clarify the language of what we're talking about here, right? What is the difference between saying something's actually the case and making a noematic statement, right? So when I talk about my experience of this, right, in the noematic sense, and I try to understand how is that different from what I'm doing when I treat it as an actual object. And here he emphasizes that the noema is not about the actuality, right? It's not an it's not an existential category in that sense, right? The Noema is really just a conceptually useful term. He argues not only for phenomenology but also for psychology. And think about it this way: imagine, and I think the reason he goes in this is because it's sort of helpful to understand the Noema and the differentiation between actuality and the Noema. Is because, for instance, imagine, for instance, you have a patient who is hallucinating objects, right? Maybe they hallucinating another person here, right? And you can imagine that obviously, right? And so in psychology, it's helpful because not everything that people perceive is real, right, or has actuality. But for instance, when someone's hallucinating, right, and they are, as it were, directing their consciousness towards this thing, right, and they're doing so in such a way um, that they're relating to it in an almost analogous sense, in the sense of actuality, because they're treating it as having its own properties, right? I guess, right? And so it could be psychologically even significant category here, because it gives for instance, the psychologist or the natural scientist here, it gives them a vocabulary to talk about false perceptions insofar as they actually have to be and are perceived, even though they don't have actuality, right? Now, of course, he then it sort of turns about face, Husserl does, and argues, but don't worry, I'm not doing psychology here. This is not what phenomenon. Husserl constantly is reminding us that this is not a natural scientific thing, because nature's been suspended in the phenomenological epoch. And so, but this is a nice way to sort of understand that there is a difference here between the actuality, right? Noema is about the appearing of something. It's about the appearing of the X, or in the case of the apple trees, it's about what are the components, for instance, um, of this appearing in particular, right? Okay, so now we sort of clarified a little bit about the difference between our statements of actuality and our statements of noematic contents. Now, let's talk about noematic sense here and the distinction between the imminent'el and the actual, right? So what is the difference there? We've been using this term for a while. How is that different from actuality? Because the two seem, at least in our natural attitude, they seem simultaneous, right? The first thing here is that imminent'el cannot be a second reality that's superimposed phenomenologically on actual reality. He makes a long argument about this, where he emphasizes that if we were to superimpose one reality onto another, and we're thinking here as there's mental process reality, and then there's like real reality, and somehow they're combined together. That's not what the imminent'el can be, because if it is, then that means I mean, for a number of reasons, you end up with the logical impossibility of a reductio ad, I'm sorry, of an ad infinitum reflexivity, right? Because what eventually happens is, okay, well then how are these two parts of reality? So you postulate a third reality and a fourth reality. It's some version of like a third man argument, I think, or at least that's the argument I would give. And I believe that's the type of argument he's making there. So it can't be that. So what is the imminent'el? What does it mean to be imminent'el? Well, remember that when we talked about the phenomenological epoch, this when we suspend, if you will, the natural attitude, and we bracket and parenthesize our formal remarks regarding um, the actuality of things, we've only parenthesized it. We didn't really get rid of it. That's an important thing to remember. We didn't truly get rid of it because we just parenthesized it in this mode of consciousness, in this mode of reflection that the phenomenologist is doing, right? So that means that when we talk about the imminent'el, it is precisely the correlate to consciousness, right? And by the way, when we say parentheses, that just means we're preventing judgments about actuality. Now you put all this together, and that means that Husserl thinks that the full noema specific moment only fashions one kind of necessary core stratum in which further moments are essentially found in. So he sees this as a unitary structure, and that's really important. So the imminent'el is not a superimposition of the actual or some sort of synthesis with actuality, right? The imminent'el is the correlate of consciousness itself. Um, So, and it can't, and so it's sort of fascinating. Even when you think about, what does it mean for me to be experiencing right now as I'm experiencing, right? In the imminent intuitional reality that I can be conscious of here. Well, in a certain way, I can never answer that because that's really what all of phenomenology is trying to answer, because it is consciousness, right? So that's the first sort of thing, and that's a unitary phenomenon, right? That's not. It has to be, right? Otherwise, you end up with absurdities and you end up with logical paradoxes and so forth. Okay, so section 91. So what we have to do now is extend this sphere of intentionality to its widest sense, to the widest scope that we can push it, right? Because there are different noematic structures correlated as different forms of mental process, right? So we have these different forms of mental process. Think, for instance, the difference between willing something, imagining something, wishing for something, valuing something, and so on and so forth, or making a judgment. All of these are different mental processes, and there must be different noematic structures, right? Remember, the noematic refers to the way in which these things are relating in intentionality. So within the full noema, we must separate essentially different strata which are grouped around a central core around a pure objective sense, right? So now we're putting together this notion of the central core and the sense in which we can talk about there being objectivities. Now, he does go on to say, well, we need to scrutinize the sphere of consciousness here. Or, quote, let us scrutinize the sphere of consciousness still further and try to get acquainted with the noetic, noematic structures in the principal modes of consciousness, on page 188. Okay, well, so you see how he's using the noema here as a way to further elaborate and understand intentionality. Section 92, he talks about the noetic and the noematic aspects of attentional changes, right? Remember, when I gave this example of different mental processes, I gave the example of willing and thinking and doing these sorts of things. All of these signify a certain type of mental regard, a certain way of comporting or moving and directing my consciousness towards something, right? So we have to talk about the ego and mental regard. What does that mean? What we're talking about here are what we might say are attentional changes, right? That my attention is changing in a certain way. And you'll see he doesn't mean attention in the way that we typically would use the word attention, right? Because what we're talking about is a change in the whole mental process itself. So it's not about the change in the object so much as it is to say it's a change in the mental process of comporting myself. And you'll see I keep using this language of comportment, and I think you'll become comfortable with that as a way to understand how oneself becomes with others and with other things in consciousness. So let's give an example, right? So imagine I see a tree and then I remember a tree, right? Here I changed the example slightly. I said, I see a tree and I remember the giving tree. Perhaps you read the giving tree. It's a story that even as an adult, if I read it to my children, I cry. So you should read it. It's great. But imagine, for instance, I see a tree and then I think of the giving tree. Now, I have a shift in my attention and I have a shift in mental process too, right? A shift from perceiving the object, right, in the imminent'el sense in which you can't get rid of it, right? I can close my eyes, but it's still there, right? And it gives me these concatenations in the present, as it were. But I can shift my mental process towards remembering, recollecting, right? So you can see here that I can move from a perceptual noesis to a memoric noesis. Remember that noesis refers to what's really inherent in the mental process, not just the sort of, not in the sense of the noema, right? And I'm changed. So what's really inherent in the perceptual process shifts into a memoric process, a process of remembering, right? So the question is, what is going on there, right? What's going on? So we see that there's attention complexes, right? That must mean that there's formations and structures of attention because there's lots of different mental processes that seem to be recognizable here, right? So you can say is that, well, on the one hand, we can talk about the actionality mode. There must be a way in which these complexes get actualized. And there must be a way in which they get suspended or they're not actualized, right? Because think about it, when I'm perceiving something, then I'm not remembering, right? And when I'm not remembering, I am perceiving, right? I'm not perceiving in this imminent'el sense. So you can see here that there's a change in consciousness in terms of what almost looks like on and off switches, actionality to non-actionality. And this, by the way, raises an interesting question for me to think about ultimately whether or not he's articulating, this is a mathematical sort of question, whether or not Husserl's pure phenomenological philosophy ultimately is mathematizable. He says no, it isn't, but it's hard for me not to wonder here in whether or not more advanced logics could make sense of this, because here we sort of see there's an actionality and non-actionality. Now I don't want to get into that, but anyway, it's an interesting question. He says, quote, "It is clear that these are modifications of the mental process itself, and also that they affect its noema," right? So that means that the modification in consciousness occurs at the level of the noesis, and that also must fortuitously affect the noema, right? Which is the sort of secondary part here of the component structures of the of something as we characterized it. Okay, so so you can see here he's digging in, and it's getting interesting. And what this next means is that a shift in attention is not a case of adjunct conjunction to something identical. Now, let me explain this a little bit. What do we mean by adjunct conjunction? An adjunct would be when something that's not essential is added to something else, right? And his argument here is that it's not that the shift in consciousness here that occurs in these attentional non-actuality, right? That this shift isn't just something that's there and we're just adding things together, right? There's not something identical and we're just adding different sections to it, right? It looks like there's a true fundamental shift in the mental process. Now, that has its own noesis, and there's certain noeses appear to be conditioned by this attention, which is very interesting. So there's a sort of conditionality. This will become very important when we talk in phenomenology later about the sedimentation of habit. So we'll get into that in a couple of videos here from now. So from 192, it is in their actionality mode, right, that attentional formations have, in a preeminent manner, the characteristic of subjectiveness. Now, this is fascinating because what does it mean here? It means that when this actionality mode occurs within an attentional formation, right, then that is what it means to talk about myself in a consciousness in terms of subjectivity, my own subjectiveness here. So he's beginning to uncover really what is very interesting and provocative and deep insights here about what it means to talk about subjectivity, and this is exciting actually phenomenologically, because he's having a way to organize it purely through description, because he's just describing, again, that's the phenomenological method, description and reduction. He's describing these modes of consciousness, and he's coming up here with an articulation of what subjectivity itself means. That is, subjectivity as subjectivity. So that, which is really powerful and really provocative and really requires more than what Husserl gives us here. But think about it, because subjectivity is a major theme within the history of philosophy, and of course within this course. So let's move to 93. He then shifts focus and makes a transition to talk about the noetic and the noematic structures of the higher spheres of consciousness. So we have a shift of focus here. And here's the question at the end of the day. That is, how are the structures which belong to the high spheres of consciousness built, right? Insofar as there are a number of noeses built upon one another in the unity of a concrete mental process. How are these formed, right? So remember, what we're talking about here is when I make these attentional shifts, there's different noeses and there's different noematic structures, right, of comportment, if you will. And so the question here, and they're grounded on each other, but since there's different ones, there's willing, there's thinking, there's valuing, and on, right? There's remembering, there's perception, right? There's a whole range potentially. Yet, number one, how are these all combined together to work? There must be a higher level which organizes them, right, into some sort of unity, because my experience of consciousness is a concrete mental process, right? I'm not experiencing any of these higher levels because it's all it's all given to me in a pregnant form of consciousness, right? The content's filled in. So how are we going to do this? And he says, well, what we're going to have to do is we have to look and analyze and describe these things phenomenologically by looking at the eidetic laws which govern the particular components, which govern the species. Now remember, here the idea is if it's a higher level, then that means that all of these actionalities, right? All of these noeses and noematic structures must be governed by eidetic law, right? In which there must be universal features to all, which give us basically knowledge about what these higher levels will ultimately consist in. That is, it'll give us a sense of their genetic structure, right? So he then sort of begins, so, okay, and he talks about noesis and noema in the realm of judgment. Because, of course, one of these actionalities is to make a judgment. And let's start with what a predicated judgment is, right? A predicated judgment is when I'm when I make a judgment that something is the case about something else, and I create a subject predicate formation. Any sort of S is P, right? So I say the clock is out of, let's say the clock is green, right? There you go. There's a predicated judgment, right? Now remember here, we can, in normal daily life, we make these predicated judgments all the time, and those predicated judgments are dependent upon our assumption of actuality and the natural attitude. All of that is suspended, though, in the phenomenological movement here. And so we can say is that when we make a predicated judgment, there is a noema, right? And the noema refers to the judged insofar as it is judging, the judged as judging, right? So what is judging, in this movement? Well, judging is distinct from what is judged about. And that's what judged as judging ultimately means here, right? Is that the act of judging is different from the judgment that is made, right? So, so the question then is, or let me read you the quote actually, right? Quote, to the judgment mental process, there belongs correlatively as noema, the judgment simpliciter, right? That is the very judgment itself is really at the end of the day a proposition, right? In the logical sort of way. But he doesn't necessarily mean that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the judgment is a sort of proposition, but there a proposition is already overly complicated with its logical association, right? But it ultimately is just that's the best he can do, and frankly, that's probably the best I can do to think about it. But you can see here that it's not necessarily that, I don't think. Now, there seems to be two senses of a judgment content, right? So when I make this judgment simpliciter, right, I make the judgment SSP, then there's content that gets filled in, right? And there's a noetic concept. So on the one hand, there's the noetic concept of judgment, but on the other hand, there's content which the judgment can have identically in common with likelihood, with the question, with other act noemas or noeses, right? So that means that when I'm making the judgment about something, on the one hand, there's the judgment part, which is peculiar form of proposition making on the one hand, right? That's the concept. And on the other hand, in the judgment, the content is something that's movable between these different types of things, right? So if I make a judgment about a clock, well, I can also, for instance, have different noeses. I can have different clock. I can talk about clocks or perceive clocks with different actionalities. So it seems like you can move it around. So in the same way I can ask a question about it, I can make a judgment about it. So there's different mental processes that are at stake, and he's trying to signify that. Sorry, I got hung up in my language a little bit there. But it is sort of, you can see it's hard to explain. Or at least you'll have to forgive the poverty of my explanations. Section 95 here is there's analogous distinction then between the emotional and the volitional sphere. So when we're talking about having an emotion of something, right? I weep, for instance, when I read the Giving Tree, right? And then volition here, for instance, when I have free movements of activity, right? So volitions and emotions, he thinks it's analogous here, right? The same structure between the noesis and the noema is also the same. So for instance, if I make a value judgment about something, I say that, for instance, cutting trees down indiscriminately is wrong, right? So I have a sort of value. Let's say I see a forest that's been clear cut, and I have seen forests that have been clear cut, horrible, um, right? On the one hand, there's the value objectiveness simpliciter, right? There's the fact that I'm making the value. I think it's horrible, right? But there's also the value as a noema, that is the content, right? Um, or no, there's a sort of mistake. Yeah, I think there might be an error here. I think I may have mistyped it. Right, because what I want to say is that on the one hand, there's the simpliciter, the making judgment, and then there's the content that gets filled in within the noema. There you go. So, quote, just as the perceived, as perceived, stands over and against perceiving in a way, excluding the question of whether the perceived truly exists, so the valued as valued stands over against the valuing, and likewise in a way excluding the question of the being of value. Remember that we were just talking about the question of what are these higher structures, and you can see here that it looks like that the valuing as valued is more essential actually than the particular content of a particular this or that, right? Because the particular content can change from being a question to a judgment to a value, right? I can move the content about in these different ways. And so it's the perceived as perceived, it's the valuing as valuing, it's the judging as judging that ultimately is pointing us into the direction of this higher sphere of eidetic law, right? And this would hold the same for volition as well, right? When I have the idea of agency, for instance, is one way of thinking about it. So, okay, now he transitions, and this is going to be the end here of this chapter section. And I'm going to sort of read, but I'll note, really frankly, this section on Noesis and Noemas is quite fabulous. You can also see it's dense, but I hope this video has helped you see some greater clarity here. And I should say is that before I sort of go through this is our last video on Edmund Husserl. Our next video will be on Martin Heidegger. And so actually I like the way Husserl ends this because really the goal is here, you can see his approach here to uncovering and analyzing pure phenomenology. We're going to look next at Martin Heidegger, and we're going to see his argument, and we'll see that he gives really, I think, a more nuanced and he is the student who exceeds his master, I think, ultimately. But there's some great remarks here at the end, and ultimately, in this chapter, it's interesting. There was this section right before he moved to the next chapter. Husserl always sort of takes time, I think, to appreciate phenomenology. And here's a couple of things that he talks about. He says, any consciousness is a consciousness of something. That's intentionality. And the modes of consciousness are obviously highly diverse because of the way that we've analyzed it and we've done these reductions. All of it is hard. And all of it is hard. He says this is difficult, struggling work. You can see here is that there's a couple points in the text earlier where Husserl sort of thought that he could be able to wrap this up, I think, a little bit easier than he's been able to. Right? He says, quote, there's no royal road into phenomenology, and therefore none into philosophy. Right? There's only the one road prescribed by phenomenology's own essence. And the idea here is that as we've been talking about the noesis and the noema, we've started to uncover this structure of intentionality, but it was really hard. And you can see there's a lot more to it than maybe we were hoping for, right? And there's no way around this because what we're discovering is something that can only be described according to this essential way. And that means that the phenomenological description here has an objectivity outside of ourselves, if you will. But not really, because it's outside of ourselves in view of ourselves, you might say. But it's sort of really fascinating here, and it raises the question. Ultimately, I'm always remembering here that Husserl is cross-eyed watching mathematics department and thinking about what they're doing over in their offices when they're writing on their boards, and they're involved with all of these eidetic components and all these eidetic objects. What exactly are they doing in consciousness? And here you can see that phenomenology is actually providing us a way to understand this, because you can at one point he talks about the mathematizing attitude, and you can see here, well, okay, how would that relate to this question of the actionality or the non-actionality of certain noematic structures, and certain noeses that are therefore within. Um, uh, that's probably, that language is even problematic, right? But I love this. There's no royal road. We have to just follow descriptively here, which also means what? It means we're not making this up necessarily. I say necessarily because there's always a question here, but we're not making up. We're allowing our description of consciousness to guide us. So that means that phenomenology here, we have to remember, is only presented as an exposition, as a very beginning science. And so I know that many of you have been watching this video or reading these books and really found them tough. And that's exactly right. It is tough. He says, our procedure is that of an explorer journeying through an unknown part of the world and carefully describing what is presented along these unbeaten paths, which will not always be the shortest, right? So you are an adventurer in consciousness if you are doing phenomenology. And thank you so much for watching this video. I look forward to our next video in which we'll talk about the eminent philosopher, Martin Heidegger. Thank you, and I'll see you guys online.